Welcome to the Generation F podcast, a podcast where three generations wrestle with faith, asking modern day questions.
Welcome back to the Generation F podcast. We are joined today with a special guest. In the past couple episodes, we were going over different ideas in the Old and New Testament that pertain to defining not just sin, but these different aspects that we see across different generations. In episode 1, we were discussing the Hebrew translations to sin, iniquity, and transgression. And we used a couple of scriptures to kind of have some interesting conversations about that. In episode 2, we went into the New Testament and talked about these Greek concepts that were in alignment with what was being talked about in the Old Testament. Today, we do have a reoccurring guest, Yuri. We plan to have like an interesting conversation on maybe more of the psychological / epigenetic aspect of certain afflictions or mental health. I don't want to speak for him in terms of what we're going to be talking about, but I do kind of want to start us off with the introduction of Yuri. And we also have my co-host, Maddie. Phil's still on vacation, so we don't have him for another week, but we are going to get started. And I want to open us up today with Maddie reading a scripture in the book of Numbers. It's going to be Numbers chapter 14, and that's in the Old Testament. And once Maddie reads that for us, we're going to talk a little bit about it, and then we're going to allow Yuri to kind of go through some ideas that he has within his field.
Numbers 14, we're starting at line 18. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now.
So one of the things that is happening in this chapter is Moses is talking to God, and he's reminding God about the previous conversations that were in Exodus that we did touch a little bit on in episode 1. You see this line quoted multiple times in the Old Testament, at least over half a dozen, if not more times in different books, where he's talking about these different sins and afflictions and things that the people of Israel were doing, once they left Egypt. And he talked about the iniquity, the sin, the transgression that they were doing. And what he's quoting here is this thing that I kind of missed the last time we did the episode that really just kind of stuck out to me. It's what Maddie had read, but in verse 18, it says, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Now, we talked about that as kind of the basis of episode 1, but one of the things that I want to talk about with Yuri today is this idea of forgiveness still with some kind of a consequence. When we look at this in modern days application, if you will, we see this idea that, okay, God forgives us of all these different things that we've done, whether we did it willingly, knowingly, intentionally, or even unintentionally. But sometimes there is a cascading effect, this ancestral or generational degradation or effect that comes of our actions. Simple examples could be, we use the idea of substance abuse a lot, more so because that's just, very personal to my life. You may get treatment, you may find faith, you might have all these things that kind of right the wrongs in your life, but there is some kind of a cascading effect. Maybe it affects your children, maybe it affects your grandchildren based off of their susceptibility to having that same kind of an issue. But I want to kind of have Yuri kind of dive into more of the epigenetics and the psychology or psychiatry behind this idea, and tying in different concepts that he has from having a Russian Orthodox background, if possible. Yuri?
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. It's been a little while since I saw you last. The question that always pops into my head is, where do I begin, right? Especially prepping for discussions like these, this depth and magnitude. I definitely appreciate the warm welcome. You know, one of the things that I do for my work is I work with people who have had a lot of trauma, a lot of difficulties. In general, psychiatry is probably one of the younger fields where we understand the least about the things that manifest in people's lives, people's minds. It's very easy to say certain things and be dismissive of them, as in mental illness is just a behavioral manifestation, right? But in general, the less somebody works with such disease states, such people who have difficult pasts, difficult lives, the less likely they are to understand it and understand what they're going through. And so, I just want to kind of lay like a foundational perspective of what type of things people experience in general, without naming any names, obviously, but people experience a lot of traumas, a lot of difficulties, a lot of isolation, especially in our world, despite the hyperconnectivity of our technological advances. Nowadays, pretty much everything, including your vacuum cleaner, is connected to the internet in some sense. And despite this hyper-connected world, it seems like we're more and more isolated, and maybe not even necessarily isolated in a sense where we can't see each other, right? Because you can have a Facebook group, you can have an Instagram group, your pet can have an Instagram page, whatever it is, right? And on the surface level, it gives this sort of perception that we're so hyper-connected. I know this person, I know this person, I know this person. And if you really think about it, it's not until the invention of the internet that this intensity, the intensity of these symptoms that people experience on a daily basis, whether it's anxiety, it's worry, it's stress, that we haven't seen it like this before. And the question there is whether it's a matter of exposure or if it's a matter of we just now are finding out more and more about how these things impact our lives. But in general, the rate of anxiety and depression and sadness, social isolation is increasing. And we're seeing it start out as young as ages 8, 9, 10 even, right? Early middle school. And, one of the issues is it's really easy to blame things on the advent of social media. And while, yes, that certainly plays a big role, we kind of have to step back and see the bigger picture. And, this is one of those segues where I would like to take into the epigenetics role, where while I'm not an epigeneticist, obviously, but I did take a couple of courses where, epigenetics was a big discussion. And so it's also easy to say that everything is genetic, right? Everything's outside of my control. These large genetic studies that are coming out, or the big human genome project, right, that was completed, it basically puts this onus on everything is predetermined in some sense. And so the concept of epigenetics has been kind of floating around, but not really too discussed in the realm of medicine, psychiatry, up until maybe like 2012. When we started seeing a lot more impact, right? A lot more, this, I guess, hyperconnectivity of the internet, you start to see more and more articles coming out. And I think one of the very first articles that I read was back in 2012 about the impact of people experiencing famine during World War II and the effect on their progeny later down the line, up to as far as 3 or 4 generations. And so I believe this article was one of the ones that mentioned people being at a higher risk for developing diabetes, who were, the progeny of people who survived the famine. And that was one of the first times that I ever read about that. And it gave me kind of like a head scratcher. Well, apparently it's not just genetics. Apparently it's not just the thing that, you're born with, and that's all self-limited to you and you only. And that can be both a distressing and a comforting feeling, right? That while this is the thing that I experience, I may be having a difficult time with it, but in the very least, the people who are around me, my family, my children, are not going to be impacted by it. Well, realistically, it turns out that's not the case at all. Reality is that the epigenetic changes are basically those changes that, in response to the environment, are allowing certain genes to be turned on or turned off. Propagation of certain genes to code for proteins to, create certain manifestations within somebody's body, somebody's brain, how they react. Prime example of that being, people who experienced famine, their progeny being more susceptible to diabetes later down the line. And so this is one of those things where, people who are experiencing trauma, who experienced trauma in the past, in childhood, it's a big environmental trigger, environmental stressor to activate certain things in the genetic kind of line of code that everybody has in their DNA. And so it's an interesting thing that we, in the field of psychiatry, whenever we discuss and we start to get to know somebody comes in for a visit, we ask them questions, not only about their symptoms, right? But also one of the very important aspects of our kind of line of questioning is, how did you grow up? Like, what is your kind of psychosocial background? What was the environment as a generality where you grew up, and how did you respond to it, right? Because somebody can say, my parents were always fighting, disagreeing, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, my experience, my perception was I was loved, I was taken care of, I felt safe, right? Whereas somebody can have a completely different perception, even if their experience was relatively the same. So in that kind of context, we actually use a scale. It's called like the ACEs scale, adverse childhood events. And so that gives us kind of like a component of how a person rates their experiences, growing up in the psychosocial environment. Did they have any intense emotional experiences, especially in the early stages of development? And of course, we also ask the family history, because that gives us a good kind of direction of which to explore further what their symptoms are and how could it be investigated further, whether this is bipolarity or OCD or anxiety or depression or that kind of thing. And, not to go too far off of the topic of faith and generational faith, many times I see people who come in from a very supportive background, even if it's not necessarily religious in a sense. They say that, my difficulties in my life didn't begin until, later down the line. And then we go through the genetic aspect of it all. And then my grandmother had severe trauma. My mom had severe trauma. And there's this kind of generational aspect to it where it's almost as if the genetics become the environment. And in the sense where there's a lot of stress, there's certain genes. I even read an article about this in the Science Daily. There's certain genes that are responsible for expressing how somebody responds to the cortisol, stress hormones. And so these genes get upregulated the more stressful the environment is. And, one of the things that we see when somebody starts going through therapy, starts taking medications that may actually impact their anxiety or their sleep or their mood. While all that is good, oftentimes it's a very limited benefit unless a person is able to kind of find themselves in the environment that gives them meaning, right? In which they're able to either give back or receive love or both. And we can kind of see the trajectory of that person's development from, let's say, being accepted with a therapist, with a good psychiatric provider. We start to see a little bit of a change in their personality and the dynamic and how they treat themselves. So on the certain epigenetic component, I would say that this is a very significant environmental shift for them. With that shift in environment, a lot of different manifestations come about. They start being a little bit nicer to themselves, nicer to others. They start working on themselves. They start to be a little bit more connected with society. And in that same article, I read that in general, when somebody has a strong societal connection, social connection, under that psychosocial context, especially in the context of religiosity and having faith, they tend to do better, but not only do better for themselves, but also they have a tendency to impact the people that are around them. So in a sense, I believe this is one of the things that was mentioned in the article, where it's transcendental not only to them vertically, but also across the spectrum with all the people with whom they interact. So people who have had, let's say, trauma, right, and now have become psychiatric technicians or mental health technicians, whatever the case may be, they through resolving of their own traumas have a tendency to be able to give back to the community and kind of help others. And so there's that epigenetic aspect, all the genetic stuff aside, and the social, it all overlays as a holistic aspect of a person.
Yuri, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question if I could.
Please.
In relation to, that scripture reading, if you recall from the beginning, I was wondering how you would connect that personally with that idea of iniquity. Like, as in our actions have kind of like a continual side effect or consequence.
So in terms of the iniquity, right, there is something that I wrote down from the actual Eastern Orthodox theological framework. So first, let me address the iniquity part. Iniquity and I remember, like you guys were talking about in the past couple of episodes, the iniquity aspect is different necessarily from sin, right? The pardoning of the iniquity of these people, but not necessarily removing the guilt from the children, at least in my interpretation from how I've seen in the psychiatric field, right? That just because somebody is able to work through these problems, is able to do benefit not just for themselves, but maybe across the board, it doesn't necessarily negate their genetics, right? But it also doesn't necessarily negate the fact that their behaviors leading up to the point where they were accepting of their, let's say, either wrongdoings or iniquities or shortcomings doesn't necessarily negate the impact that they have had from the negative aspect on other people. And so in this sense, this actually struck a little bit of a thought when you were reading this off, Ethan. When we have a relationship with God, we can ask for forgiveness. We can be forgiven. We can receive grace. We can do all we can to bring ourselves closer to Christ and to God in communion with Him. But that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that the implication of our sin and of our shortcoming is not going to just be resolved just because we have received forgiveness. That will continue later down to the progeny. And it's not necessarily, I feel like it's really easy to misinterpret that phrase. And this is going to be my personal take on it. I don't believe this to be the case where God is intentionally trying to punish us for the fourth generation, because out of spite or out of bitterness. I believe this to be a matter of our fallen human nature, being from the sin from Adam that was started across all humanity from Adam committing that greatest sin. It's almost as if I had to come up with a metaphor on the spot, I would say that if you put in a bunch of holes into a fence with nails or a nail gun, you made grave mistakes, right? You can pull those nails out, the holes will remain. And so it's the same kind of principle that may have been playing out in a sense where a person can have transgressions against God, against His laws. And even though somebody repented and received forgiveness and grace and pulled those nails out, that doesn't change, epigenetically down the line, the sins that have been impacted either on the genome or on the progeny or, later down the line, because there's still some effect. The things that we do, whether positive or negative, they impact us on this level, on the level of the earthly realm. And
do you mind if I interject for a second?
Yeah, don't let me ramble.
No, you're good. Yeah, because it's going to lead into my next point. But before we kind of put a cap on that idea, first, describe progeny in layman's terms, and also if you have any idea of how Russian Orthodoxy kind of communicates this concept, keeping in mind that most people won't really understand the specific nuance. One of the things that you see in the Old Testament is this idea where, whether it's in Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus, and a couple of the other books in the Minor Prophets, when they mention this idea of third and fourth generations, there's a key word in there that I see reoccurring. It's up to, right? So the words up to imply almost like a range or a cap of how much this can last with you. But it's not a promise. It's just a capacity or a length of time. And that's how I interpret it, where it's not to say that, okay, if I battled with drug addiction, 4 generations from now, my descendants are going to have drug addiction. It's more so this idea that there is this lingering genetic expression or spiritual expression that can linger up to a certain point, but may not, depending on the circumstance. And I don't think there's a science behind it per se, or at least I just don't have the wisdom to understand it. But give me a clear definition of the word progeny, and then also maybe some orthodox ideas if there is anything communicated specifically about that generational sin aspect, without talking about Adam, because we're going to talk about that in the next segment.
So progeny just being your line, your lineage later down the line. And I'm actually so glad that you brought up the up to aspect of that verse, because nothing is impossible with God, right? The point that you're making, that we're not locked in to our genome. We're not locked into this specific box of like, you committed a sin, 4 generations, boom. It's not set in stone. That's the beauty of it. From the Orthodox perspective, in general, the visiting of the iniquity of the fathers onto the children, I would say that it's not I've made notes about this. It's not a judicial act of a vengeful God. I know I alluded to this earlier, of a vengeful God punishing innocent grandchildren just for the sake of punishment. It's basically a systemic propagation of how certain maybe aspects of wickedness they propagate through time. And it's interesting because in Orthodoxy, there's the aspect, I know we don't want to talk about Adam as of yet, but there's the ancestral sin, right? It's more related to the concept of fallen human nature. Is that the reason why we as humans, we struggle and we have all this wickedness in our world on earth now, is related to the fact that human nature as a whole is fallen. The only redemption is through Christ. Many people think that I can be a good person and I can define good however I see fit. The reality is not that simple. It doesn't mean that just because you feel good about the thing that you do, or society tells you that you do good, it doesn't mean that you are in fact doing good in the eyes of God. The lukewarm verse comes to mind. I forget exactly what it is, but many people will call me Lord, 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 but I will say to them, "Be gone from me, I never knew you."
Yeah, we did that one last episode.
Yeah. It's one of those things where there are certain things that we believe that are good, that we can be impacting the world in a positive sense, and yet at the same time propagating sin further. Somebody may believe that they're a good parent, but yet they're impacting their child in such a way where they're propagating that generational trauma from their grandfather, their father, and later on down the line. And it's not one of those things that somebody realizes until very, very late, until it's way too late.
Yeah, in my notes, I have this kind of idea of epigenetics, or even the idea of something being in some way of saying like hereditary. This is a very outside perspective. I know nothing about psychiatry or biology, but I think of something as simple as, fetal alcohol syndrome, or these different things that are just very obvious consequences of someone's behaviors, right? But I don't believe that epigenetics is used to prove the Bible right, and the Bible is used to disprove or prove epigenetics, right? But I think what it can be done is used as a very interesting talking point to give perspective and context to this idea of generational issues. And that's kind of what I wanted to really roundabout way kind of, finish up, is this idea that the spiritual descriptions and the scientific or biological descriptions can coexist in a certain way. They may be explaining each other, but they also may not be, depending on how you want to spin it. But one of the things that I want to give is context to when people read the Bible and they see these very thought-provoking passages and they have no way to base it. The idea of epigenetics really kind of connects to this ancestral or generational curse, if you will. And one of the things that we're going to transition to is in the book of Romans, where Paul, the apostle who's, writing to the Church of Rome, he takes like a zoom out perspective of what's going on. Because again, for the audience who doesn't know the New and the Old Testament, when Paul's talking to these different churches with these different letters, and he's going on these different trips to kind of preach to these cities and these countries, these people aren't descendants of Israel. They're just European or Middle Eastern, like there's, Mediterranean, they're in these different areas. So he's trying to explain things to them in a way that they can gravitate towards that may apply to them, because they don't have that same lineage, they don't have the same bloodline as the people that you would see traditionally in the Torah or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So when we go into Romans chapter 5, We're going to start in verse 12. And the caption to this says, death in Adam, life in Christ. And this is a different translation. I put away my children's Bible for today just because I wanted to get some words out. And I'm going to start reading. It says, and this is Paul talking to the Roman church. He says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man being Adam, right? The story of Adam and Eve, and death through sin, right? So this idea that the idea of death is directly connected to sin, because before Adam, there was no death. Death is a consequence of rebellion. It's a consequence of that original story in the Bible with Adam and Eve, and then the tree and the fruit and all that. So it says, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. That's the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments. But sin is not counted where there is no law. That's an interesting passage. We'll have to circle back to that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is an interesting talking point. I don't want to leave undone, so we can kind of hyperlink that. Yeah, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. I'm going to pause there because there's a lot of meat here. You know, this idea in verse, I believe it was 13, it says, but sin is not counted to where there is no law. I'm not a theologian. I don't pretend to be. But a lot of things in the Bible that you'll see, especially in the epistles and also just purely opinion based, I think a lot of this has to do with very specific people types, maybe very hard to reach areas that just don't have the development to have certain laws and regulations, and there's like a different expectation put on them. You know, I think of someone on an island, right? You know, they're not going to be held to the same standard as someone who came from Egypt or Rome in the eyes of God, right? There is this very specific grace that, you know, is kind of applied in that idea where, again, this is all my perspective, but in that one little line, he's talking about God understands nuance and he understands the nature of reality to the smallest degree, whether it's the smallest island to the largest nation. He's judging everyone accordingly based off of what they feel they can be held accountable of. And Yuri, I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's how I've always felt when I read that one line.
You know, from my stance, like now we discussed this, it really is an interesting line where it shows that God's judgment and his grace is not just universal across everyone. Adam's sin is across all humanity because we are all, as human nature, we're fallen. But this gives me this perspective of somebody, if they don't know of God's laws, they're the commandments, the ideas, right? But who Christ is and how being in communion with him saves us from death in the world. The judgment is not going to be the same. Judgment is not going to be the same for somebody who is aware of the laws, aware of God's laws, and transgresses them voluntarily, purposefully, intentionally. Whereas somebody who simply does not know because of exposure, because of, or lacking the ability to read or understand or whatever the case may be, or simply hasn't had that kind of exposure to the scriptures at all, that judgment is going to be different. But we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know what kind of judgment or what kind of grace God is going to have for each and every one of us. It's very hard to. There is a lot of meat over there. You're right, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like you can get lost on that one line, and I'm sure everyone has a very different opinion on it, but that's just something that I've always kind of seen where there's just individual nuance to people that just didn't have the opportunity, or maybe it can even be something as simple as mental capacity, you know, mental health, or, you know.
You know, the interesting aspect there is, like, I kind of wonder about the expression of the soul. So if somebody has the ability to say prayers and the knowledge and the opportunity, but doesn't, versus somebody who has absolutely no ability, no possible opportunity, no location where to go, whether it's church or to pray with somebody else, or to even have that kind of social dynamic where somebody can be and even entertaining the idea of God. That's one of the things. It's a big differential. I would say that it's not as simple as we would probably make it out to be. And a lot of people would probably say, take a non-nuanced approach and say, well, there's the laws and the rules, and if you don't follow them, you're just going to hell. And that really realistically doesn't do anybody any good. And to kind of transpose from that idea, you see a lot of that in psychiatry and medicine, that, well, if somebody can't follow the rules, the laws, or whatever, somebody just can't stop doing a certain behavior, then, they're wrong. And there's only one punishment for them, one judgment. And that's not necessarily the right way of doing things. And that's why there's so many nuances to everything. And if you have to consider nuances, right, there's only so many nuances that we as humans are able to even hold in our head, like even consider. Whereas God's ability to see us is very personal, it's very individual, and it's very, very intimate in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I'll even take it a step further and bring it more into the mental health perspective. When I was younger, I had an uncle who was, I don't know what the proper term would be, but he was like a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was very afflicted with his mental illness. For the most part, was conversational, but couldn't organize behaviors and thoughts traditionally, to kind of say the least. But yet I believe that he knew God in his own capacity, and he had some kind of expression of faith, even though his limitations were that of not having law, right? So I think it could be something as simple as an indigenous tribe that just didn't have exposure to certain, concepts or ideas. And that's, again, this is all fantasy and extrapolating, but I think, it could also be taken into the idea of just someone that can't uphold law, right? Whether that's like some kind of a mental standpoint. I do want to continue. And just at the end of this verse, it talks about the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. That line is interesting because a lot of times in the Bible, Jesus is referred to as the new Adam, right? His coming was to undo the things that Adam had done in that first rebellion, that first quote unquote sin that happened. That's just kind of like an idea for people to understand in context why you would see Adam being used together when we're talking about Jesus. And I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I want to read another few verses before we kind of sink our teeth into it. So verse 15, it says, but the free gift is not like the trespass. Trespass in this verse is the Greek translation of the word transgression. So trespass is things that you're doing intentionally wrong. You're doing it against God's law, right? So, but the free gift is not like the trespass, for if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gifts by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. And the free gift is not like the result of that one man's sin. The judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. I want to read one more verse. It says, for if because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Well, one of the things that Paul's known for is like run-on sentences. So if you read a lot of the epistles, it almost kind of feels like, where's the comma in here? Like there's a lot of things going on. But within these 6 verses, if you will, one of the things that he's really talking about in a zoomed out approach, and again, a lot of this can kind of be missed, is he's acknowledging the law of Moses. He's acknowledging the expectations and the standards that were given to the people of Israel. But he's trying to apply these concepts to the rest of the world. He's trying to apply these concepts to people that maybe came from more of like a pagan or polytheistic, world or worldview. And he's saying that, all right, well, even if you don't identify with this one little tribe in the Middle East, we are still bound by the same consequence because we all come from one man. We all come from one man named Adam. He was the first of God's people. He was the first of God's people, really. He was the first creation to be of God's doing, right? So he's trying to really just kind of point this in like, okay, this is why Jesus came. This is why I'm preaching to you about the crucifixion, and he's kind of doing his little ministry. He's talking about this is a free gift because of all the things that we did against God throughout the ages. God loved us so much that he sent his son to be that sacrifice, right? So that we wouldn't receive judgment. And this is one of the things that I want to talk about in the next episode is what does that actually look like? You might hear these things like, okay, Jesus died for me and, he did this and he did that, but like, how do I interface with it? What does this really mean practically? But for the time being, we have this interesting comparative of we have the epigenetic idea that we were trying to talk about earlier with the Old Testament talking about up to 3 to 4 generations of something consequential. Yuri talked a little bit about what the clinical realm would, discuss with certain gene expression, if you will. And then we have this completely different perspective in the New Testament where Paul's almost like trying to apply these multiple concepts and almost simplify it. A lot of times when you see the New Testament, Paul doesn't often mention these concepts of transgression, iniquity, and sin. It's all kind of called sin in some wording, trespassing or wickedness, but he's representing everything by one idea because it was all taken upon Jesus on the cross for that curse, right? So he kind of consolidates these ideas a lot of times when you read these books in the New Testament, because he's trying to drive the point across that no matter what the affliction is, we have the resolution. So Yuri, I don't know if you have any comments on that excerpt in the book of Romans and maybe some thoughts that are different than my own.
Something immediately stood out. As you can see, I'm taking so many notes that I'm writing out of paper. This is what I do typically. One of the things that really stood out, and I wrote it down, the concept of a free gift, right? Makes you wonder. So the idea of a gift, right? There's nothing that somebody did to deserve it necessarily. Nothing that's done to, instigate somebody else to give somebody a gift. A gift is just given. It's just that. There's no necessary request, nothing of the sort. It's not transactional. It's simply that I am giving this to you because I love you, because I want this to be for you. What's the responsibility of the other person? The other person, he or she can take the gift, accept it with grace, or reject it. And, conceptually speaking, what Paul talks about this application, not just to a small tribe of Israel, right, in the biblical sense, where it's just one set of people that's, selected for that purpose, right? And then everybody else is left. This gift applies to everyone, should they be willing to receive it. And this is the concept that I see as a development, that if somebody's given something and you express a gratitude for it and joy to receive it, that brings you in the specific context of receiving a gift from God, that brings you in communion closer to God, to Christ. But should one reject it and transgress further, do things that are not good, not just because God doesn't like it or whatever, but because they're bad for not just yourself, but for your children, for your family, for humanity across the spectrum, that will inevitably lead to not just the demise of one person who rejects the gift, but to all the people who follow that person. That is a much bigger consequence. And we see that both not necessarily just in the epigenetic, familial genetic sense, but this is what the Bible is essentially discussing, that, this death reign through them, right? That's when somebody follows a person who is rejecting of God's grace, God's mercy, and God's gift of offer new life. Because in essence, in sin, someone dies, they die completely. Their soul does not persist because they rejected Christ's gift of eternal life.
Do you agree with my, not interpretation of Romans 5, but just how it was kind of spoken? Because one of the things that I have in my notes is this oversimplification of Adam brings forth death, and then Jesus, being the new Adam, brings forth life. So it's this very simple, childlike idea. If one person brings this and the other brings that. And then Paul's trying to talk about this inheritance that we have, aligning ourselves with Jesus and following these teachings. But there's also just this, again, comparative and zoomed out approach to these ideas, where he's trying to connect these stories and these happenings of the different people with something that people can relate to, but also hold them responsible to the idea that we all come from the same family tree, whether we like it or not.
I definitely agree with you, Isaiah, on that part. And, the thing that it's important to remember is that at some point in time, it's not that Adam was always bad or the sinner. Adam made the choice. He was in communion with God, and he made the choice to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. And he fell out of communion with God. And so Christ's coming was a redemption. It's a reconstitution of that communion with Christ that through which Adam and all his progeny can be redeemed. And it's a very, as you mentioned, the run-on sentences of Paul, they make you kind of wonder what's the essence of that verse. But I agree with you on the concept that this is one of those things where Adam's transgressions, so to speak, they fell across all of humanity, and only through Christ we can be redeemed. And that's the gift. That's the gift that we have. And but the difference being is that it's up to us to accept it or not.
It's this idea that like psychiatry can help us understand behavior, and even science can help us understand biology, but the scripture tells like a much larger story, And I think in some times they can support each other, and other times there's general contradictions or just differences of opinions. But with your background and also your faith practice and orthodoxy, if you will, when we take like a Paul lens of this, we kind of zoom out a little bit, and we are taking into consideration these ideas from the Old Testament with sin, transgression, iniquity. And even in the New Testament, when you start to see things kind of get consolidated and lumped together, because again, there's more of this emphasis on Jesus being that sacrifice, that resolution, if you will, in simple terms. What are some things that you can take away from these concepts that are maybe completely lost in psychiatry? Because in most cases, the treatment isn't the resolution, right? It's enough to maybe uphold some issues, or quiet some of the effects of most people, or you kind of insert whatever you want to kind of say with that. But there is no cure, right, to most mental health disorders. There's treatments, right? And what Paul's trying to talk about is a cure to this disease of sin, right? Just to kind of put it simply, this consolidated umbrella of intentional, unintentional, and inherent wrongdoing, right? What are some things that you take from those camps, those ideas, if you will?
Such a good question. That's akin to asking, what is the cure? What is the cure to the human condition? What is the cure to human suffering? In our humanistic sense, we're never going to be able to understand, first of all, what is even, healthy, right? What is cured versus non-cured versus sick. But also this level of responsibility that we have for our own well-being and our own kind of desire to be with Christ, desire to commune with God, desire to be a positive impact on the world. And it's never a simple, easy answer. It's really, really simple to say that, mental illness can be managed simply by medications and therapy. And while that may be a very important part of treatment, it's necessary, right? Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, what happens after we start treatment? The treatment is deemed, let's say, successful. The majority of the symptoms may be managed, whether it's anxiety, depression, sadness, whatever. The question becomes, what do we do with that? And what kind of impact does somebody else have on the world? And is this one of those things where treatment will help an individual be closer to God, or will it take them away from the path? It's very hard to answer, and not every answer obviously applies to every single person out there. But I would say that as a generality, that psychiatry and faith are not antagonistic to one another. I would say that they're in fact very synergistic. Having faith in general is a very significant portion of, I don't know if it's treatment. It's not something that I can prescribe, because obviously I'm not a theologian or a priest or anything of that nature. But, in general, what I see is, at least in my practice, is that people who have faith, they do have a lot more connectedness to their experience as a as a person struggling with mental illness. And many times people who have this kind of positive disposition, even if they're having a recurrence of certain symptoms or flare-ups or difficulties, whatever the case may be, people who have more faith, who have faith in God and their ability to be redeemed, right? And understanding that they're suffering for some reason or another, but they're not alone, that Christ also suffered and that he's there with them. I see a different those people, and that connectedness to meaning it's not antagonistic to healing, right? It's synergistic to it. That's a very, very key point to have faith. I see, many people, even when I cover hospitals, I see people improving much faster when they have a positive disposition, positive mindset, and the meaning behind as to why they want to get better. It's never as simple as like, I want to get better for the sake of getting better. I want to be better for my children. I want to be better with my family. I want to be more giving to my community. And when the conversation turns to Christ, people with faith, they have a tendency to have a lot more meaning, even if their symptoms are significantly more pronounced.
Yeah, I was listening to this one podcast earlier today, and it was very simple the way it was put, but I liked it because he was talking about the definition of faith isn't belief, it's trust, right?
Oh, that's so good.
And I really like that, and I'm going to steal it because I think whenever someone says,
Me too.
yeah, they say that I have faith, everyone just kind of thinks like, oh, you believe in something invisible, or you're just putting whatever a belief system into something, but really it's trust. Like if you have faith in a doctor can cure you, you're trusting in their education and their skill set to create a resolution. So whenever you see people that have faith, one of the reasons why they have like a higher rate of progress is because they're trusting in something. It's the same thing in my line. If an athlete doesn't trust that I can get them to their destination, they simply will not grow. They won't adapt. There needs to be trust for their body to believe in the work that they're doing for an adaptation to happen. And I think that physically and spiritually, like you said, we're synergistic. So without trust in God, right? I whenever you read like the Old Testament, you always see these lines like trust and obey, right? It's this idea of that you're in some Bibles, they'll say faith and obedience or whatever, but I think the words are interchangeable. So it's this idea that faith is trust. Faith is trust that the things that you're doing are going to have a better result for you and nullify those potential generational occurrences or curses, if you will, to kind of wrap everything together. And that is something that I want to kind of continue to talk about in the next episode, is this idea of, okay, how do we trust in Jesus and God? And what does that look like mechanically? Because I'm a very mechanical person. What does it look like to have faith? What does it look like to actually continue with this idea versus just having knowledge of it? Having understanding of the Old Testament and the New Testament, like what are these practical steps that we can take? So in closing, Yuri, I do thank you for sacrificing your time again. You were always a very highly praised guest on the last episode you did.
Well, glory to God for all things, brother. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, anytime. If there's any closing statements that you have, if not, I do appreciate your time again.
Maybe for your listeners, I can give a small one, that if somebody is having doubts, questions about faith and difficulties trusting, right? Just know that that's not necessarily a permanent state of mind. Things change, perspectives change, ideas change, and just trust and hold in your heart, despite the fact that you may be having doubts in your head, that things can and will be better. And be easy on yourself. And I don't mean in the sense, let yourself pass with sin or anything like that, but make sure that you're giving yourself some grace, and know that it's okay so long as you still get up the next day and you still try and you still try to do your best to seek the truth. That's the end of my closing statement. Thank you for having me on, brother.
Anytime. Thanks again. And I do plan to get this episode out this week. Otherwise we'll continue next week's podcast, just kind of finishing this idea before we go into the next segment. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you for having me, brother.
Different generations, same questions. Generation F. Different generations, same questions. Generation F.